On the 13th of December 1945, a horrific and brutal war criminal was led from his prison cell, and he was taken to an execution chamber. He had been sitting on death row, awaiting his date with the hangman, and he was then led into the chamber, and British executioner Albert Pierrepoint was there to be the one to carry out the execution. Josef Kramer was a man who became known as the Beast of Belsen. Such was his harrowing actions during the Second World War, at camps such as Bergen-Belsen and also Auschwitz. He was a man responsible for the terrible conditions of one of the most horrific concentration camps, and he was not repentant and remained loyal to Hitler, Himmler and the SS. Kramer was executed for his crimes, but let's dive deeper into his story and investigate his crimes and find out what happened exactly with his execution. Join us today as we look at the execution of the Beast of Belsen, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Josef Kramer was, as a young man, raised inside of a middle-class family, and little would tell in his early life that he would become a monster during a global conflict. He worked as an apprentice electrician, but during the financial problems of the 1920s he lost his job, and went to work in different roles before on the 1st of December 1931 he joined the Nazi Party. Kramer had been attracted to the politics of the Nazi Party and Hitler, like many were, and he joined Hitler's party before he even became Chancellor. Hitler promised people a restored national pride, and because of this people flocked to support him, and he also promised food and jobs for the population. But Kramer went further, delving into the Nazi ideology, and he joined the SS, Heinrich Himmler's later paramilitary squad, who were responsible for the concentration camp administration. But Josef Kramer would rise throughout the ranks of the SS, and he completed his strict training, and then worked as a prison guard before he was sent to go and work inside concentration camps. He worked at the very first concentration camp opened, Dachau, where he served as a guard in 1934. But then he was moved across to Sachsenhausen, and then on to Mauthausen. But inside of the SS, Kramer was making a number of powerful friends. Inside of the concentration camps, Kramer felt settled, and he became a senior figure, and he was made an assistant or adjutant to Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz. It was Höss who expanded Auschwitz to a huge extent and created the camp there, and it's said that he was responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. Kramer accompanied Höss on a number of inspections, and he was later then given control of his own site, Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp, in April 1941. This camp was set up in the Alsace-Lorraine region, territory of France, and it was inside these barbed wire fences that Kramer began to participate in a huge number of crimes on a more serious level, as he was the commandant who ordered the gassings of 80 Jewish men and women. The purpose of this execution was that their remains and skeletons were to be used in a macabre exhibition. Kramer later admitted that the purpose of this camp was to force prisoners to work in the nearby quarries, and he later admitted that while serving as the commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof, that he was responsible for sending people to the gas chambers. He even outlined that women inside of the gas chamber continued to breathe for around 90 seconds whilst the gas had been administered. But the Nazis gave further promotions to Josef Kramer, and he became a Hauptsturmführer in 1942. It was later when he was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the main extermination centre inside of Auschwitz, that in this role that Kramer ran the death site, and he would oversee the killings of hundreds of thousands of people inside of Auschwitz's own gas chambers. After this, the remains were then cremated, and at this time there had been a huge amount of people sent to Auschwitz in mass deportations in the summer of 1944. Josef Kramer claimed that he did not take part in the selections to send people to their executions and deaths. However, instead he claimed he was just there to oversee the camps running. But this was proven false, as witnesses testified how they regularly saw Josef Kramer patrolling the selection ramps, and that he was picking people to be sent to the gas chambers. One witness even said that he saw Kramer loading people onto the trucks to take them to their deaths, and that he was seen beating them if they resisted. Kramer said at his trial that, "I never took part in the selections. I asked myself, is it really right about these persons who go to the gas chambers? I didn't know what the purpose of the gas chamber was." But when he was inside of Auschwitz, he did witness the Auschwitz revolt and uprising that took place on the 7th of October 1944. It was Kramer that ruthlessly put down much of the revolt, as he would torture a number of prisoners, and would also carry out executions. He also said that his guards under his command were allowed dogs to patrol, and the witnesses and former prisoners claimed these animals were encouraged to savage the prisoners. Kramer did later admit to some of his crimes, and he claimed he did strike one person 25 times with his whip, that he did dish out regular beatings to inmates, and that he also shot at prisoners too. But later in December 1944, with the threat of the Soviet Union and the Red Army rampaging towards Poland, Josef Kramer was quickly sent to Bergen-Belsen, another concentration camp. This site, to begin with, had been a camp where people who were fleeing Germany were sent, but Belsen became one of the most horrific and tragic sites of the war. There was no gas chamber, but Kramer's reign of terror was so horrific that he became known as the Beast of Belsen whilst he served as a commandant. Kramer claimed that there was no issue regarding conditions and the food there, and there was, and it was terrible. Each week hundreds and thousands of people were dying from the site's conditions, which included mass starvation and diseases which spread around the camp. There was a terrible lack of supplies, and the problems got much worse at Bergen-Belsen, as a camp which was built for a few thousand prisoners saw dozens of thousands of people being marched and transported there. There was a terrible overcrowding problem, and the camp broke down, and Kramer still instigated brutality, as he maintained some guards who had not fled. In March 1945, a very deadly typhus epidemic swept through the site, and it was this that killed Anne Frank, the famous diarist. But at this time, as well as the camp's administration falling on its knees, the German Nazi Reich was also crumbling. There was a defeat on the horizon for the Nazis, and many of the SS guards tried to save themselves, and they fled wherever they could to avoid any form of incarceration at the hands of the Soviets or the Allies. Many guards knew that they would later be condemned for their crimes, but Josef Kramer refused outright to abandon his post as the Commandant of Belsen, and he was even there to welcome the liberators when the British and Canadians arrived at the gates of Belsen. He took the liberators on a tour of the camp, showing them their terrifying sights, which involved massive piles of corpses found around every corner and in different rooms and buildings. Thousands of dead corpses were found at Belsen, and these were later buried in mass graves, and the liberators forced the SS guards found at the camp to then bury them. But amongst the dead were some incredibly emaciated prisoners who were clinging on to life, and the British had a huge clean-up operation on their hands. Josef Kramer was later arrested for his crimes, and he was imprisoned inside of Hamelin prison. Kramer then, as expected, was brought to trial in the Belsen Trials to answer for his crimes that he was responsible for, not just at Belsen, but also at Auschwitz. The court heard what a horrific beast he was, as he would beat and batter prisoners who were not fit enough to work, and they heard how Kramer then forced these people to their deaths, and he would order his guards to brutalise the inmates and prisoners. Kramer, it was found, allegedly kicked one woman to death during the selection process, and he also killed prisoners from the Soviet Union who had stolen bread to just survive. He was known to have shot prisoners who found potatoes on the ground, but then his true crimes at Auschwitz emerged as he was responsible for the extermination centre there. But for his crimes of the Second World War and before, Josef Kramer was sentenced to death, and he was then sent to Hamelin prison to await his execution, which took place on the 13th of December 1945. In the days before, Kramer had met with the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint, who had been summoned to carry out the executions, and Pierrepoint took Kramer's height and weight to estimate the drop needed on the gallows to instantly snap the commandant's neck and kill him. Kramer was to be executed with 10 of his guards. These executions began at 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and the condemned women, including Irma Grazer, were executed first, and then Josef Kramer would be fetched. He was held in a small cell next to the execution chamber, and then Pierrepoint, along with the prison guards, summoned Kramer, and he was brought into the execution chamber. The executions were carried out in pairs, and at 12:15 p.m, alongside the evil doctor Fritz Klein, Josef Kramer was taken from his cell and was led towards the gallows. There were no nooses on this structure, and Kramer was helped up the steps of the scaffold. His arms had been secured behind his back, but Pierrepoint worked very quickly. At 12:19 p.m, Kramer went crashing through the trapdoor after a black cap had been placed over his head and then the noose, and Kramer was the first of the men, alongside Klein, who were executed in the Belsen trial executions. Death was confirmed shortly after, and the body of Kramer was cut down. It was then buried inside the prison's courtyard. Josef Kramer was a man who seemed at home inside the brutality of the concentration camps. He was someone who led the brutality and barbarism of the concentration camps, and he was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people during the Second World War. But what happened at Bergen-Belsen led to him being known as a Beast of Belsen, as the conditions of the camp were truly barbaric, and Kramer was responsible for this. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.